One of the things that gets spoken about a lot on workshop is which lens or focal length to use for shooting any particular or given scene that we might be standing in front of. And the lens that you use is going to have perhaps the biggest influence on the way that you compose a scene. These two things are inextricably linked. The elements that you're going to see within a frame when you're making your composition are dependent on the focal length that you're using. But likewise, the focal length that you choose to use is going to be dependent on the different elements that you can see when you're standing in front of you at the scene. So what I want to do in this video is to have a look at the different things, the different factors which we should take into account when choosing which lens to use. Look at some of the different characteristics of the different lenses and what they bring to the scene. First of all, it's important to know that there's not just one way to photograph a scene. Any scene at all can be captured in pretty much an unlimited number of ways with different focal lengths, focusing on different aspects of the scene. But at some point, you've got to make a choice about which lens you're going to use, and that all starts with really seeing the scene. Now, I've spoken about this before in other videos, and by seeing a scene, what I mean is really seeing it with fresh eyes and trying to put away the expectations that we have that we brought to the scene with us. Because there are a couple of traits, there are a couple of things that can lead us down a particular path compositionally and stop us from really seeing all the different possibilities of a scene. And the first of those is all the images that we may have seen before of the scene, the different things that we've seen on social media perhaps, which can lead us down a particular way of composition, lead us to look at the scene in a particular way and not really appreciate all the other ways in which a scene can be captured. And the second is a little bit harder. It's to try to overcome the kind of templates that we have in our minds, the ways of working, these things that build up over time that give us a kind of comfort zone, a way of shooting scenes, a way of seeing things that we usually apply to different scenes that we arrive at. Now, for me, I started out doing photography, shooting the coastline here in Portugal near where I live, and everything that I did was shot with an ultra wide angle lens with some little bits of rock in the foreground and then some water and then a nice sky. So for a long while, that was my template. And whenever I arrived at any scene, I was always kind of looking to shoot it in a similar way with a similar wide angle template, foreground, some kind of focal point, and then a really nice sky. But of course, there were times when that template just didn't work because there was no strong foreground element. And what I found is that when the template didn't work, I could be a little bit of a loss at how to shoot a scene. So to develop our photography, it really helps to try to overcome these templates and to try to see a scene without them. We can start by seeing what the different elements of the scene are and what the main focal point is, or the thing that we're going to shoot, the center or the anchor of the composition. And is that focal point, is it isolated from the rest of the scene, or is it supported by other elements that we can see? So for example, is there a strong foreground element that works to balance with the main focal point? So here, for example, in this image from Tuscany, the main focal point is the house in the background, but the flowers in the front are a really strong element that balances it. Or when we shoot images next to the water, we might often look for a rock or something like that in the foreground to balance with a focal point in the background, like a mountain or a rock stack or something like that. For a scene like this, what we might want to try is an ultra wide angle lens, which is going to fit the whole sweep of the landscape, the whole panorama, from a foreground that's immediately in front of the camera all the way through the scene to the background and then the sky beyond. Images with a wide angle lens have this incredible depth, a three-dimensional feel that make you feel like you can literally step into the frame. But it's this same capacity to include everything in the frame that means we have to use them very carefully, because it's very easy to get a really messy frame when everything is included. So when we're composing with a wide angle lens, what we need to understand is that pretty much everything in front of the camera, from the foreground to the sky, is going to be included in the frame. And what we need to do is to evaluate all of those elements and to ask ourselves, does the inclusion of this in the frame strengthen the image or does it weaken it? For example, the foreground, is it interesting? The texture, the color, does it actually add to the image and create a counterpoint to the focal point, or does it weaken it? Just grass or mud or sand on a beach or a shapeless rock, it doesn't really grab the eye. It's actually dead space, and that can often make the image feel weaker and flatter because the eye gets caught up on it. Flat sand on a beach doesn't add anything to a frame, and if that's the case, it's better to shoot with a focal length that removes it and compose the image in a different way. It's the same with the sky. How important is it to the scene? If it's a really dramatic sky with lots going on, then for sure, yeah, you're probably going to want to include it with a wide-angle lens. But if there's not really much happening in the sky, if it's flat, a little boring, or just plain blue, then it might be a better choice to use a different focal length that actually minimizes the effect of the sky, that minimizes the amount of sky that you've got in the composition. Wide-angle compositions tend to work best when you have three elements in the scene which all have equal strength. So you have a really strong foreground which kind of balances as a counterpoint to a strong main focal point with an interesting sky or background behind it. Or when you're working in enclosed spaces or need to fit as much as possible, which is the case in these images from Iceland. With a wide angle image, the eye is going to move through the image, taking in each of these elements as it passes through it. So it's important that each one of those elements is quite strong. And one thing to bear in mind when you're using wide angle lenses for landscapes is that distant things will appear much smaller than they do to your naked eye. So when you're shooting in mountains, for example, it will make distant mountains seem a lot smaller and reduce their impact in the image. You can be standing in the middle of towering peaks all around you. But when you frame them with a wide angle lens, those peaks are going to be reduced, which can diminish the impact that they have in the frame. A mid-range zoom lens will do a little bit of everything, and at the wide end of the lens, that's about 24 millimeters on a full frame or about 16 to 18 millimeters on an APS-C. At that wide end, they tend to work really well when you have some of the elements that we talked about before with the wide angle lens, but perhaps one of those elements isn't as strong. So for example, as I said before, if you don't have a particularly strong sky, then a mid-range zoom is going to allow you to reduce the amount of sky in the frame. Or if you don't have a very strong or very interesting foreground that's close to the camera, then a mid-range lens is going to allow you to reach over that, as you can see in this image here. A mid-range zoom lens tends to work really well when you have two strong elements within the scene. So for example, you have your main focal point and then you have a really strong background, a really strong sky behind it, which balances with it or that harmonizes the scene. And they don't reduce or diminish distant objects in the same way that a wide angle lens does. So they work really well when you're shooting mountains without reducing or diminishing the impact of the mountain in the frame. One thing that you do need to be aware of though with mid-range focal lengths is that while you can fit in the same three elements that you do when you're composing with a wide angle lens, the foreground, the main focal point, and then the sky or the background beyond, you do have a lot less space when you're shooting with these focal lengths. So things can be a little bit crushed if you've got a foreground that's really close to the camera. If you're trying to include that in the frame, it's going to mean reducing the sky a lot. So you're going to be removing quite a bit of the sky from the frame. But likewise, if you want to include quite a bit of sky, then you're going to lose a little bit of the foreground and maybe only have a little bit of the foreground showing at the bottom of the frame, which can really weaken the effect of the image. So they tend to work best when the foreground is a little bit further away from the camera, not when it's immediately in front of the camera, but when it's further and deeper into the frame. And before you click the shutter, you should just scan the edges of the frame with your eye, just to make sure that everything has enough space to breathe, to make sure that a mountain isn't too close or touching the top of the frame, or that the foreground isn't cut off too much and that it has enough space to actually be fully resolved and have strength in the composition. And at the other end of a mid-range zoom lens, so that's at about 70 millimeters on a full frame or about 50 millimeters on an APS-C, then you actually have short telephoto and you get some of the same characteristics that you would do with a telephoto lens. So there's a degree of compression between distant and close objects. But for me, whichever end of the mid-range focal length that you're using, the same principles really apply. If you have a really strong focal point and a really good background and it's unsupported or isolated from the rest of the scene, then this is the lens that I'm going to reach for. Now, if I'm standing in a scene and there's one really strong element, one really good focal point that's disconnected or isolated from the rest of the landscape or framed by something like mist or cloud, then I'm going to reach for a telephoto lens, because a telephoto lens is really good at picking out and isolating just a small part of the frame. And they're not dependent on having good weather or having a good sky. You can even use a telephoto lens when it's raining. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when you're creating these kind of images, that main element has to be something that's really strong, that's really interesting, because the eye is going to go straight to it and it's not supported by anything else in the scene. Telephoto lenses work really well for creating abstract images from repeating patterns within the landscape, and the compression that you get from a telephoto lens is really good for pulling distant objects much closer. So they're great for compressing a closer focal point with a more distant object like a mountain peak. And this for me is one reason why I find that when I'm at an elevation, when I'm up amongst the mountain peaks, a telephoto lens is essential, as I can focus on distant mountains without reducing their size or diminishing their impact in the frame. Now, I've talked in previous videos about using telephoto lenses to create minimal images and to isolate subjects, but you can also use a telephoto lens to capture multiple images and lots of depth within the landscape. You just have to compose and frame the image in a different way. But you can still work with those same three factors, with a foreground, with a midground, and a sky behind, with giving you plenty of depth, but it's going to have a very different feel, and it's not going to have the same sweep that you get from using a wide angle lens. So these two images were captured at the same time. This is a wide angle capture where we have all the depth of the alpine plain from the front to back. And this is the same scene with a telephoto. Although it only captures a part of the scene, it still has each of the elements: the huts on the plain in the foreground, the mountain behind, and then the rising sun coming up through the clouds. It's got a very different feel, and the telephoto compression really makes the mountain in the background feel bigger, like it's looming above the hut. This is another example. This is the wide angle view of the scene with all the depth from the foreground up to the background, but the dominance of the mountain is diminished by the wide angle. So the mountain here is really supported by a very strong foreground and a very strong sky in the background. But here, captured about 50 minutes later with a telephoto lens, the mountain is the dominant element within the frame, and it feels very different as the telephoto lens reaches over the foreground of the water and captures the side light on the trees and the mist around the mountain, and this becomes the main part of the image. What you need to remember when you're composing frames like this with a telephoto lens is that each element that you include in the frame has to add something to the composition and has to be equally strong, just in the same way that it does when you're shooting with a wide angle lens or with a mid-range zoom. And in the same way, each element needs to have plenty of breathing space around it. And also remember that when you're using a telephoto lens, just small movements of a meter to the side either way can make significant changes in the composition in the way that the different elements relate to each other. So to wrap up, one of the things that I've mentioned in this video is the number of elements that you see in a scene and how a wide angle works really well when you have three really strong elements, how a mid-range zoom works really well when you have two strong elements, and how a telephoto lens is excellent for isolating just a single element in a scene. But it's really not that simple. It's not as straightforward as that. A wide angle lens is for when you want the whole sweep of the scene, when you want everything from the immediate foreground in front of the camera all the way to the background and to the sky beyond it. A mid-range zoom will work in a similar way, but you don't quite get that same feeling of depth or 3D that you get with a wide angle lens, because the foreground is not going to be immediately in front of the camera. It's going to be a little bit further away, or maybe omitted completely as you reach over it. And the background is going to be a little bit closer and dominate a little bit more inside the frame. A telephoto lens works really well for isolating your subject and creating a minimal image, but it also works really well for compressing different aspects, different elements of a landscape together. You're still going to have a foreground, a background, and the sky beyond it, but that foreground is going to be a lot further away. Okay, right. I think that's it for this video. If you've got any questions, any comments at all, just drop me a comment in the box below or send me an email and I'll get back to you. And as ever, I hope it's been interesting and I hope it's been useful. Now, if you enjoy my photography and you'd like to join me on a workshop, I'll be launching new tours for next year. Throughout the rest of the year, I'll be in Iceland, Norway, the Dolomites and Tuscany. And moving into the future, I'm also putting together plans for trips to Madeira and Patagonia, and there'll be another trip to Namibia too. So check out my website for more details on the trips and sign up for the newsletter to be the first to find out when they're launched. And of course, when we can travel again, I'll be making vlogs from those trips and from some of the other trips that I've got planned. And so that's it for me. Thanks for watching and thanks for everyone who supports the channel. It's really appreciated. Take care and good luck with your photography. See ya.